bag.
Tuesday.
More than a quarter century after the big and dumb and lucrative laughs of the first Scary Movie took the box office by storm in 2014, years after the dreadfully unfunny Scary Movie V seemed to put a definitive stake in the heart of the franchise, the Wayans creative team finally regains control of the jokefest they originally created. But unfortunately, it's a wasted opportunity that fails to recapture the anarchic spirit and cultural relevance of the original films. The new film is officially titled simply Scary Movie, eschewing any numerical designation. Guess it's like the convoluted deal with the Halloween franchise, with the original John Carpenter masterpiece in 1978 and then a million sequels of varying quality, and then another movie called Just Halloween in 2007 directed by Rob Zombie, and then another movie simply titled Halloween in 2018 directed by David Gordon Green, which ignored all the chapters after the first, Halloween, and served as a direct sequel to the 1978 original. And that isn't necessarily a bad philosophy when it comes to rebooting a beloved franchise. The decision to reset and return to basics shows that the Wayans brothers understand that the franchise had gone seriously off the rails after they departed following Scary Movie 2 Inches in 2001. The third, fourth, and especially fifth installments, produced without the Wayans' involvement, had become increasingly desperate and creatively bankrupt, relying on the lowest common denominator of humor without the sharp satirical edge that made the first two films cultural phenomena. A refreshing runtime after recent comedy bloat, still recovering from the 132-minute slog that was the repetitively jokey and not particularly clever Masters of the Universe. Speaking of reboots that overstay their welcome, I was genuinely grateful for the relatively zippy 96-minute running time for Scary Movie 6.0. In an era where comedies increasingly feel the need to justify their existence with bloated runtimes that somehow mistake length for substance, the decision to keep this installment lean and mean was a wise one, at least in theory. The problem, of course, is that runtime efficiency only matters if the content filling those minutes is actually entertaining. You can have a 90-minute comedy that feels like it drags on for 3 hours, and you can have a 2-hour comedy that breezes by. Unfortunately, despite its merciful brevity, this new, Scary Movie too often feels like dead air, with long stretches where the jokes simply don't land and the energy dissipates completely. The original, Scary Movie, understood pacing. It moved with manic energy from one gag to the next, never giving the audience time to catch their breath or question the logic of what they were watching. It was a comedic machine gun, firing joke after joke with the understanding that not every bullet would hit the target, but enough would connect to keep the audience engaged and laughing. This new installment, by contrast, often feels like it's firing blanks, with the occasional live round reminding us of what the franchise used to be capable of achieving. The core four returns. Nostalgia as both asset and liability. It was genuinely a kick to see the original core four of Regina Hall, Faris, Marlon Wayans, and Shawn Wayans reprise their signature roles after all these years. The reunion of this beloved cast was the primary selling point in all the marketing materials, and rightfully so. These four actors created characters that became embedded in the pop culture consciousness of an entire generation. Faris's Cindy Campbell became the definitive parody of the final girl trope, playing the sweet, naive, yet surprisingly resilient heroine with perfect comedic timing. Regina Hall's Brenda Meeks was the loud, opinionated best friend who said what everyone in the theater was thinking, often serving as the franchise's sharpest satirical voice on racial dynamics in horror films. Marlon Wayans' Shorty Meeks was the perpetually stoned comic relief who somehow survived situations that should have killed him multiple times over. And Shawn Wayans' Ray Wilkins brought nuanced comedy to what could have been a one-note gay panic joke, instead creating a character with surprising depth and heart. The question facing this reunion was always going to be, can these actors recapture the magic that made their characters so beloved in the first place? Or would the passage of time and the changed cultural landscape make these characterizations feel dated and irrelevant? The answer, unfortunately, falls somewhere uncomfortably in between. There are moments, fleeting, precious moments, where the old chemistry sparks to life and we remember why we fell in love with these characters in the first place. A perfectly timed reaction from Hall, a physical gag from Faris that showcases her underrated commitment to comedy, a knowing look between the Wayans brothers that speaks to their lifetime of collaborative creativity. These moments exist, and they're wonderful. But they're far too rare, and they're surrounded by material that simply isn't worthy of these performers' talents. A promising opening that sets unrealistic expectations. The opening sequence featuring an award-wielding Tiana Taylor as a heightened and hilarious version of herself showed genuine promise and ingenuity. But that was pretty much the high point of the entire film. This opening scene demonstrated that the creative team understood how to update the franchise's sensibility for a modern audience, satirizing celebrity culture, award show pretension, and the specific brand of self-serious artistry that has come to dominate prestige horror in the elevated horror era. Taylor, a performer known primarily for her music and dance but who has increasingly shown impressive acting chops, throws herself into the parody with admirable commitment. The scene plays like a twisted version of the opening of Scream, but filtered through the specific absurdities of contemporary celebrity culture, social media, brand management, the performance of authenticity, and the weaponization of victimhood for publicity purposes. It's sharp, it's knowing, and it actually has something to say about the current cultural moment while still delivering the kind of outrageous gore and shock humor that fans expect from the franchise. In other words, it's everything the rest of the movie should have been but mostly isn't. From that point on, there were entire scenes that made me feel like I had taken a vow of silence, not because the material was so shocking or offensive that it left me speechless, but because the jokes were landing with such a dull thud that any laughter would have felt forced and dishonest. Comedy is subjective, of course, and what leaves one person cold might have another person rolling in the aisles. But there's a difference between humor that doesn't align with your particular sensibility and humor that simply isn't working on any level. Too much of this new, scary movie falls into the latter category, with jokes that feel like they were written by a committee that understood the formula of what a scary movie joke should look like but didn't understand what made those jokes actually funny in the first place. The fundamental problem: parodying parodies. Just as the first Scary Movie built its framework on a mashup of the original Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, and then peppered in a myriad of references to other films ranging from The Blair Witch Project to The Sixth Sense to The Matrix, the 2026 Scary Movie is built on the framework of the so-called requel films in the Scream series, specifically 2022's Scream and 2023's Scream V, with room for jokes about The Substance, The Matrix, Smile, Megan, Final Destination, The Terrifier, Midsommar, and on and on. That choice feels like a fundamental stumble right out of the gate. In 2026, a scary movie making fun of Scream movies, which from the get-go were inside joke takes on horror films filled with meta-commentary about genre conventions, is like a Russian nesting doll of comedy, where the laughs get progressively smaller and less satisfying with each reveal. You're essentially creating a parody of a parody, and at that point, what are you actually satirizing? The original Scream films worked because they were smart, self-aware deconstructions of horror movie tropes that also functioned as genuinely effective horror films in their own right. They had their cake and ate it too, delivering legitimate scares while simultaneously commenting on the mechanics of those scares. The first Scary Movie worked because it took that self-aware approach and pushed it to absurdist extremes, adding gross-out humor, sexual comedy, and a willingness to be completely stupid in service of a laugh. But now we're at a point where the Scream films themselves have become almost indistinguishable from parodies, with the recent requel entries so laden with self-referential commentary, fan service, and metatextual analysis that they're practically parodying themselves. What's left for a scary movie to satirize? The result is a comedy that often feels redundant, underlining jokes that have already been made rather than finding new angles or insights. Why not take a bigger swing and do a full-on parody of a modern classic such as Get Out, Sinners, or Weapons? Each of those films merits a one-off gag here, with only one landing with any resonance. We've seen such a remarkable renaissance in the horror genre over the last 15 years that it feels like a genuinely missed opportunity to still be chasing the Scream franchise rather than engaging with the wealth of fresh material available. The missed opportunity of modern horror. The horror landscape has transformed dramatically since the last Scary Movie installment in 2013. We've witnessed the rise of what critics and audiences have dubbed elevated horror, or prestige horror films like The Witch, Hereditary, The Babadook, It Follows, and yes, Get Out. which treat the genre with artistic seriousness while still delivering genuine scares. This movement has been simultaneously praised for bringing new audiences and critical respect to horror and criticized for creating a false hierarchy that suggests some horror films are more worthy than others. It's a cultural phenomenon ripe for satirical examination, filled with contradictions, pretensions, and absurdities that a sharp comedy could absolutely eviscerate. Jordan Peele's work alone, Get Out, Us, and Nope, offers a treasure trove of material for parody. These are films that take themselves very seriously, that are laden with symbolism and social commentary, and that have inspired countless think pieces and video essays analyzing every frame. That's not a criticism. These are genuinely excellent films that deserve their acclaim, but it also makes them perfect targets for comedy. Imagine a scary movie that really dug into the pretensions of elevated horror, that satirized film festival audiences stroking their chins at disturbing imagery while calling it important, that poked fun at the endless symbolic interpretations and the sometimes overreaching social commentary. That could have been biting, relevant, and hilarious. Instead, we get surface-level references to these films, a character briefly mimicking the smile from Smile, a quick gag about Megan being a killer doll, a throwaway joke about The Substance and body horror. These aren't satires, they're just references, the cinematic equivalent of pointing at something and saying, "Hey, remember that thing?" That's not comedy, that's just recognition. The Final Destination franchise, with its elaborate Rube Goldberg death sequences, offers obvious comedic potential that has already been mined by the Final Destination films themselves, which have become increasingly self-aware about their own absurdity. The Terrifier series, with its extreme gore and virtually silent slasher villain, could be a rich target for parody, but again, those films are already so extreme and over the top that simply recreating them with comedic intent doesn't necessarily add much.
The most successful horror parodies find something genuine to say about their targets. They identify the core absurdity or contradiction in the source material and amplify it until it becomes hilarious. This new, scary movie too often settles for simple recreation with a winking tone, as if the mere act of reference is itself comedic. Plot and character, familiar faces in tired situations. In the present day, Anna Faris's Cindy Campbell, who has become a doomsday prepper recluse a la latter-day Laurie Strode in the recent Halloween films, is estranged from her teenage daughter Sarah Olivia Rose Keegan, who does a spot-on imitation of Faris's vocal patterns and physical comedy style, and Tuesday, Savannah Lee Nassif, who is named Tuesday because for legal reasons the film can't call her Wednesday. Get it? This is emblematic of the film's approach to humor, a joke explained as a joke killed, and too many of the gags here come with their own explanatory footnotes, as if the filmmakers don't trust the audience to get the reference without having it spelled out. The Wednesday joke could have been a fun throwaway, but having a character essentially explain it robs it of any comedic impact. Regina Hall's Brenda Meeks, who for reasons that are never adequately explained is channeling Octavia Spencer's character from Ma, has twins, Sydney Park and Brad Greg Wayans, and I think that's about as deep as we need to go into the plot, because we don't expect complex storylines from these movies, we're just hoping the gross outside gags, the cheap sex jokes and the wink at the audience Easter eggs produce more than nods of recognition and the occasional mild laugh. But here's the thing, the original, scary movie, for all its stupidity and gross-out humor, actually had a reasonably coherent plot that drove the action forward. Yes, it was a parody plot, and yes, it was intentionally absurd, but there was a narrative engine that propelled us from scene to scene with purpose and momentum. This new installment feels scattered and episodic, like a collection of sketches loosely connected by the thinnest narrative thread. Characters appear and disappear without explanation. Subplots are introduced and then abandoned. The central mystery that should be driving the action is so perfunctory and undercooked that it's barely even there. Alas, this structural weakness means that the film lives and dies entirely on the strength of its individual gags, and when those gags aren't landing, which is far too often, there's nothing else to sustain audience interest. An overcrowded canvas, too many characters, not enough comedy. There are so many returning supporting players and so many new characters jammed into the story that Cindy and Brenda sometimes become off-screen afterthoughts. For a film that marketed itself heavily on the return of the original cast, it's remarkable how often they're sidelined in favor of newer, less interesting characters. This is a common problem with legacy sequels and reunion projects, the desire to honor the original while also introducing fresh blood for a new generation. It's a difficult balance to strike, and this film doesn't manage it successfully. The new characters aren't developed enough to be interesting in their own right, but they take up so much screen time that the beloved returning characters don't get the showcase moments fans were hoping for. Marlon Wayans' beloved stoner character Shorty Meeks and Shawn Wayans' barely closeted Ray Wilkins don't fare much better than the female leads, as they're both stuck in the same one-note joke loops that defined their characters 25 years ago. Shorty is still getting high and surviving impossible situations through sheer obliviousness. Ray is still making awkward attempts to conceal his sexuality while everyone around him knows the truth. These character dynamics worked in 2000 because they felt fresh and because the Wayans brothers brought enough charisma and inventiveness to their performances to keep the jokes from feeling stale. 25 years later, without significant evolution or new angles on these characters, the jokes feel like stale callbacks to a different era. Humor dependent on, "What's up?" the Budweiser advertising catchphrase that the original, Scary Movie, parodied to great effect, and Brokeback Mountain feels beyond stale in 2026. These references are 20-plus years old at this point, relics of a different cultural moment. The fact that the film is still mining these particular wells for comedy speaks to a creative bankruptcy at its core. The ensemble commitment can't save weak material. Raunchy humor abounds throughout the film's runtime, and to their credit, the entire ensemble, including the newcomers who haven't been introduced to audiences before, are comedic gamers who go all in no matter how ridiculous the premise or how potentially humiliating the gag. There's something admirable about watching performers fully commit to material, trusting that their commitment will sell jokes that might not work on the page. Anna Faris has always been a fearless physical comedian, willing to debase herself for a laugh in ways that frankly few actresses at her level would consider. Regina Hall brings genuine acting chops to material that doesn't always deserve her talent, finding nuance and character moments even in the midst of absurdity. The Wayans brothers, of course, have been doing this their entire careers, and their comfort with this style of comedy shows. But even the most committed performances can't save material that simply isn't funny. Comedy requires more than just commitment, it requires timing, surprise, insight, and that indefinable spark that separates a joke that works from one that doesn't. The attempts at edgy commentary, exemplified by a visual gag about the Epstein files, are neither particularly provocative nor funny. They feel like attempts to generate controversy or headlines without actually having anything meaningful or insightful to say about the topics they're invoking. Edgy comedy requires a point of view, a perspective that justifies the provocation. Simply referencing something controversial isn't edgy, it's just lazy. The occasional hit in a sea of misses. I did laugh at one bit about a group of passengers on a train turning violent over being lectured about using the proper pronouns. This joke worked because it found the absurdity in a real cultural tension without simply taking a side or making a cheap political point. It satirized the performative aspects of both sides of the debate, the self-righteous lecturing and the over-the-top resistant reaction, in a way that felt genuinely observational rather than mean-spirited or preachy. This is the kind of cultural satire that the Scary Movie franchise should be doing, finding the absurdities in contemporary life and amplifying them for comedic effect. When the film operates in this mode, it justifies its existence and reminds us why we love these movies in the first place. The Kenan Thompson-led jab at The Blackening, likely what the review meant by Michael, played like a moderately successful SNL sketch, which makes sense given Thompson's long tenure on that show. The sequence had the heightened energy and broad performances that characterize the best SNL material, and it benefited from Thompson's natural charisma and comic timing. However, describing something as playing like a moderately successful SNL sketch is faint praise at best. SNL sketches are typically 3 to 5 minutes long and are designed to deliver a simple premise with a few variations before getting out. A feature film needs to sustain interest and comedic energy for 90-plus minutes, and simply stringing together a series of moderately successful sketches doesn't accomplish that goal. Racial humor, playing it too safe. As for the racial humor, including the obligatory observations about stereotypes in Hollywood casting and the ways horror films traditionally treat black characters, a few of the jokes worked, but nothing seemed particularly edgy or bold. This is disappointing because the original, Scary Movie, films, particularly the first two directed by Keenan Ivory Wayans, were fearless in their approach to racial comedy. Those films weren't afraid to make audiences uncomfortable, to push boundaries, and to say things that other mainstream comedies wouldn't touch. They used horror movie parody as a framework to comment on race relations, cultural differences, and the absurdities of representation in Hollywood. The humor could be juvenile and crude, but it was also often sharp and insightful in ways that surprised audiences expecting just another dumb comedy. This new installment feels like it's pulling its punches, afraid to offend anyone or generate the kind of controversy that might limit its box office appeal. In the current cultural climate, with heightened sensitivity around representation and the potential for social media backlash, that caution is perhaps understandable from a business perspective. But it also means the film has lost one of the key elements that made the franchise distinctive. When you're making a movie called Scary Movie, that's designed to be transgressive and outrageous, playing it safe is a fundamental contradiction. You can't be edgy and cautious at the same time. A strong finale that reminds us of what could have been. I kinda love the brutal, ludicrous final twist, which matched the opening scene for bold humor and genuine surprise. Without spoiling the specifics, the ending takes a hard left turn into genuinely dark territory, undercutting everything that came before in a way that's both shocking and hilarious. This ending works because it commits fully to its absurd premise without winking at the audience or pulling back from the implications. It's the kind of, we can't believe they actually went there, moment that the franchise built its reputation on, and it lands with genuine impact. The problem is that this strong ending only serves to highlight how much of the middle section of the film was treading water. A great opening, a great ending, and a lot of mediocrity in between creates a frustrating viewing experience. You can see the potential, you can see what the film could have been with tighter writing and sharper jokes.
The broader context. Comedy in 2026. Part of the challenge facing this new, Scary Movie, is that comedy itself has changed dramatically since the franchise's heyday in the early 2000s. The kind of broad, crude, anything-goes comedy that dominated that era has fallen somewhat out of favor, replaced by more character-driven, empathetic approaches or by cringe comedy that mines discomfort rather than shock value. The success of films like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which combines genre elements with genuine emotional depth, or Bottoms, which delivers raunchy comedy within a framework of character development and heart, suggests that audiences want more from their comedies than just a series of gags strung together. That's not to say there isn't still an audience for the kind of comedy Scary Movie represents. The success of raunchy comedies like No Hard Feelings and Cocaine Bear, the latter being more horror comedy than straight comedy, proves there's still appetite for this kind of entertainment. But even those films brought something fresh to their respective formulas, whether through star power, unique premises, or unexpected tonal combinations. This new, Scary Movie, feels like it's trying to recreate a formula that worked 25 years ago without adequately updating it for contemporary audiences or sensibilities. The result is a film that will likely satisfy die-hard fans of the franchise who just want to see their favorite characters again, but will leave broader audiences cold and will do little to win new fans to the series. Technical elements and direction. From a technical standpoint, the film is competently made but uninspired. The direction is functional. It gets the job done without adding any visual flair or inventiveness that might elevate the material. Horror parody offers opportunities for creative cinematography and visual jokes, playing with the conventions of horror filmmaking for comedic effect. The original, Scary Movie, and its first sequel showed flashes of this, with carefully composed shots that recreated iconic horror moments before subverting them. This new installment too often settles for simply pointing the camera at the actors and letting them do their thing, without using the language of cinema itself as part of the comedy. The editing is similarly workmanlike. Comedy timing in editing is crucial. The difference between a joke that kills and one that dies can come down to a matter of frames, to the precise moment when you cut away or cut to a reaction. This film's editing gets the basics right but rarely demonstrates the kind of rhythmic precision that separates good comedy from great comedy. The musical score and soundtrack are forgettable, neither adding to nor detracting from the comedy. There are opportunities for musical jokes, for satirizing the way horror films use music to build tension, but these opportunities are largely squandered. A reunion that fails to justify its existence. In the final analysis, this new, scary movie feels like a project that existed more as a business proposition than as a creative vision. There was clearly market research suggesting that nostalgia for the original films, combined with the popularity of recent horror offerings, could translate into box office success. And perhaps it will. The opening weekend numbers will tell that story. But commercial success doesn't necessarily mean artistic success, and by any measure of comedy craftsmanship, this film falls short of its potential. The original, Scary Movie, was a cultural phenomenon that spawned countless imitators and defined a particular style of parody comedy for a generation. This new installment is merely a competent echo of that phenomenon, reminding us of what we loved about the originals without adding anything new or meaningful to the conversation. For fans desperate to see these characters again, there's enough here to scratch that nostalgic itch. Faris, Regina Hall, and the Wayans brothers are clearly happy to be back in these roles, and their affection for the material and for each other comes through in moments. There's genuine camaraderie on screen, a sense that these people enjoy working together and have a shorthand developed over decades of collaboration. But affection and camaraderie aren't enough to sustain a comedy. You need sharp writing, inspired direction, and jokes that surprise rather than simply remind. This film has moments of all three but not enough to overcome the general sense of creative exhaustion that permeates the project. The horror genre has evolved and expanded in remarkable ways since the last, Scary Movie. The comedy landscape has similarly transformed, with new voices and new approaches challenging in redefining what comedy can be and what purposes it can serve. This new, Scary Movie feels stuck in the past, unwilling or unable to engage with these evolutions in meaningful ways. Perhaps that's what some audiences want, a comfort food comedy that delivers exactly what they expect without surprises or challenges. There's certainly a place for that kind of entertainment, and there's no shame in enjoying it. But for those hoping that the return of the Wayans creative team would bring fresh energy and perspectives to a franchise that had been dormant for over a decade, this film represents a disappointing missed opportunity. The potential was there. The opening and closing sequences prove that the creative team is still capable of inspired comedy when they're working at their best. But too much of the film coasts on autopilot, relying on references rather than actual jokes, on recognition rather than surprise, on nostalgia rather than innovation. In a year that has already given us several excellent horror comedies and genuinely innovative takes on genre filmmaking, this, Scary Movie, feels like an artifact from a different era, occasionally charming, sometimes frustrating, and ultimately unnecessary. The franchise deserved better, the cast deserved better, and audiences deserve better than this lukewarm retread of past glories. The new, Scary Movie isn't a disaster, the talent involved keeps it from descending to that level, but it's a disappointment, a film that had all the pieces in place for a triumphant return but couldn't quite figure out how to assemble them into something fresh and funny. Watch it if you're a completist who needs to see every chapter in the franchise, or if you're content with just seeing these beloved characters one more time. But don't expect the lightning-in-a-bottle magic that made the original such a phenomenon. Oh, how do you solve a problem like Scary Movie? Ever since its inception a quarter century ago, here has been a comedy series defined by its crassness, its cruelty, its happy-go-lucky, stoned out of its goddamn mind bad taste. This has always been the franchise's calling card, its brand identity, its reason for existing in a cinematic landscape crowded with safer, more palatable comedy options. Criticizing it for crossing a line too taboo, or landing a joke too mean, is to highlight a feature and not a bug, at least, that's what defenders of the series have always argued. I recall rolling my eyes as a kid at the negative reviews aimed at the original while anxiously anticipating every vulgar, four-letter laced fart joke the 2000 movie could throw my way. There was something rebellious and exciting about a comedy that so gleefully violated every standard of good taste. That reveled in its own vulgarity with such unapologetic enthusiasm. The original, Scary Movie, arrived at a particular cultural moment when this kind of transgressive comedy felt fresh and necessary, a counterpoint to the increasingly sanitized mainstream comedy landscape. The Farrelly brothers had paved the way with There's Something About Mary, and Dumb and Dumber, proving that audiences had an appetite for crude humor that didn't apologize for itself. The first, Scary Movie, took that formula and applied it to horror movie parody, creating something that felt genuinely new despite being built on the foundations of earlier parody films like Airplane and The Naked Gun. And to be sure, in almost just as long a time since Marlon and Shawn Wayans were cast aside from their own franchise following the release of Scary Movie 2 Inches in 2001, the pop culture landscape has done its damnedest to evolve, shift, and transform in ways both subtle and profound. The conversation around comedy has changed dramatically. What's considered acceptable humor has shifted. The line between edgy and offensive has been redrawn countless times by different communities with different values and different tolerances for provocation. The Long Road Back, a franchise reclaimed. 25 years since the Weinsteins ripped the series away from its creators following 2001's Scary Movie 2, a move that still ranks as one of the more egregious examples of Hollywood's tendency to separate artists from their creations in pursuit of profit. We're still getting some good, hearty belly laughs about the metatextual pretensions of Scream and the self-aware horror movie conventions that Wes Craven pioneered and that have now become standard operating procedure for the genre. The history of the Scary Movie franchise is a case study in creative control in Hollywood politics. After the massive success of the first film, which grossed over $278 million worldwide on a $19 million budget, the Wayans brothers seemed positioned to continue developing the franchise according to their vision. But creative differences with Miramax, combined with the studio's desire to maintain control of a lucrative property, led to their departure after the second installment. The subsequent films, Scary Movie 3 Inches 2003, Scary Movie 4 Inches 2006, and Scary Movie 5 Inches 2013, were made without the Wayans' involvement, though David Zucker brought his own parody credentials to the third and fourth installments, resulting in films that were tonally different but still commercially successful. By the time of the fifth film, however, the franchise had clearly run out of creative steam, resulting in one of the worst reviewed entries in the series and disappointing box office returns that seemed to signal the end of the road. But, perhaps older and more pretentious myself, there's also some incredibly unpleasant cringes when the Wayans use the avarice of their own backers, first Miramax and now Paramount, to transgress into a realm some might consider obscene. The film doesn't shy away from making its corporate backing part of the joke. There are references to studio interference, franchise fatigue, and the mercenary nature of legacy sequels that feel pointed and personal. For myself, the real issue is when it stops punching up at Hollywood, satirizing the industry's greed, its creative bankruptcy, its tendency to squeeze every last dollar out of intellectual property regardless of artistic merit, and starts punching down at some of its viewers, targeting marginalized communities and vulnerable populations for cheap laughs. That's new.
The laugh meter, measuring success in a joke-driven comedy. I'd be lying though if I didn't say I laughed plenty during this weekend's Scary Movie 6, or, mockingly, just Scary Movie, on the poster, following the current trend of legacy sequels that strip away numerical designations in favor of brand recognition. The decision to simply call it Scary Movie is itself a meta joke about the state of franchise filmmaking, where reboots and revivals pretend to be starting fresh while simultaneously depending entirely on audience nostalgia and familiarity with what came before. Even with the long stretches where you could hear a pin drop in my theater, those awkward silences when a joke lands with a thud and the audience collectively decides not to force sympathy laughs, on the metric of a standard joke bag movie, where comedy is measured purely by how often you laugh rather than by any consideration of narrative coherence or character development, I'd say the hit rate is about 40/60ths against. That means roughly 40% of the jokes land while 60% miss, which sounds worse than it actually plays. In baseball, a .400 batting average would make you one of the greatest hitters of all time, and for a Scary Movie film it's definitely better than most installments in the franchise, particularly the later entries that the Wayans had nothing to do with. Though the best remain the first film, which had the advantage of novelty and cultural timing, and the surprisingly effective Zucker-directed Scary Movie 3, which brought a different sensibility to the material that, while not matching the original's impact, at least felt like a genuine attempt to do something with the franchise rather than just cash in on brand recognition. The question of how to judge a comedy that operates entirely on the quantity over quality model is a perennial one in film criticism. Traditional narrative standards don't really apply when the plot is just a skeleton to hang jokes on. Character development is beside the point when the characters are intentionally one-dimensional parody figures. In this context, the batting average becomes the only meaningful metric. Did you laugh enough to justify the price of admission and the 96 minutes of your life you'll never get back? For some viewers, that 40% success rate will be more than enough, especially if the jokes that do land happen to align with the particular sense of humor. For others, even a 50-50 split wouldn't be sufficient to overcome the jokes that don't just miss but actively offend or alienate. The targets: legacy sequels mocking legacy sequels. The gist of this one, of course, is making fun of long-in-the-tooth franchises being dragged out of the mothballs for yet another legacy sequel, a trend that has dominated Hollywood for the past decade as studios desperately mine their back catalogs for any property with residual brand recognition. And appropriately for Scary Movie, which has always been most effective when it's self-aware about its own place in the cultural landscape, the main targets are most specifically Radio Silence's Scream 5, officially titled just Scream, in 2022, and Scream Vi, 2023, right down to mocking those movies' attempts to make the term requel happen as a descriptor for films that function as both reboots and sequels. Scary Movie 6 bills itself as a reboot kel, as Marlon Wayans always welcomes shorty enthuses when coming up for air between bong hits, adding yet another unnecessary term to the increasingly convoluted taxonomy of franchise filmmaking. The joke works because it acknowledges how absurd the whole enterprise has become. We now need multiple neologisms to describe the different flavors of sequel because straightforward continuation has become impossible when franchises have been running for decades. The irony, of course, is rich and intentional. Here is a franchise that hasn't had a genuinely successful entry in over a decade, that most audiences assumed was dead and buried, being resurrected for the exact kind of nostalgia-driven cash grab it's supposedly satirizing. The film is smart enough to be aware of this irony and even to foreground it, but awareness alone doesn't necessarily transmute cynicism into genuine satire. If you've seen Scream 5, the skeleton of that movie is pretty much identical to the structure here, complete with a Jenna Ortega lookalike, Savannah Lee Nassif, here named Tuesday for legal reasons, in a joke that the film makes sure to explain in case you didn't get it, getting stabbed in the opening sequence but living long enough to bring her estranged big sister Sarah, Olivia Rose Keegan, back to town alongside a totally not sketchy-looking boyfriend, Cameron Scott Roberts. The legal reasons joke is emblematic of both the film's strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, it's a funny acknowledgement of the realities of parody filmmaking, where you need to skate close enough to your source material to be recognizable but different enough to avoid lawsuits. On the other hand, explaining the joke robs it of much of its impact. The audience would have gotten the Wednesday reference without having a character explicitly point it out. Turns out Sarah and Tuesday are the daughters of Cindy Campbell, the original final girl played by Anna Faris in the first 4 films, who is now sporting Jamie Lee Curtis's distinctive fright wig from Halloween, 2018, and living as a paranoid survivalist preparing for the inevitable return of whatever masked killer tormented her in her youth. It's a direct parody of Laurie Strode's characterization in the recent Halloween trilogy, and it's one of the more successful sustained jokes in the film, with Faris clearly enjoying the opportunity to play a harder, more damaged version of her signature character. The kitchen sink approach, parodying a decade of horror. At this point, it should be abundantly clear this is going to be a kitchen sink approach to just about every horror flick the Scary Movie franchise has missed out on since 2013's Scary Movie 5, which was the last entry before this nearly 15-year gap. That's a lot of horror movies to catch up on, given that the genre has experienced one of its most creatively fertile periods during that time, and the film tries valiantly to cram in as many references as possible. Cindy and a delightful Regina Hall as Brenda meets her back as the legacy characters, a la Scream or Halloween, but never I Know What You Did Last Summer, a movie the older characters explicitly tell the young kids not to worry about in this movie when they ask if it's related to the Amazon Prime series, The Summer I Turned Pretty. This is a funny bit of revisionist history, given that I Know What You Did Last Summer was a major target of the original Scary Movie, but the franchise has clearly decided to distance itself from that property, perhaps because it's not as culturally relevant as it once was. But Brenda is now rocking Octavia Spencer's haircut and vibes from Ma, 2019, while living in the house from Get Out, 2017, complete with the sunken place and the uncomfortable racial dynamics. Cindy's daughter works at the Final Destination theme park where everybody dies. In increasingly elaborate and improbable ways, turning the franchise's signature death sequences into carnival attractions, and their estranged buddies Shorty and the perpetually closeted Ray, Shawn Wayans, find themselves dragging the kids into parodies of Megan, 2022, and Sinners, 2025. This scattershot approach to parody is both a strength and a weakness. On the positive side, it means the film never gets boring. If one sequence isn't working for you, something completely different will be along in a few minutes. The variety keeps the energy high and prevents the film from feeling like it's belaboring any single joke or premise. On the negative side, none of these parodies are developed enough to really work as sustained satire. We get surface-level recreations of iconic moments from these films with crude humor grafted on, but rarely do we get the sense that the filmmakers have anything particular to say about these movies beyond, "Hey, remember this thing? What if someone farted during it?" The elevated horror dodge, a curious omission. Intriguingly, the prevalent trend of elevated or artistic horror movies from the last decade are mostly sidestepped, which represents a significant missed opportunity given how much material films like Hereditary, The Witch, Midsommar, and The Lighthouse provide for parody. There's a line where Cindy mentions, "It follows," but says, "That movie's too obscure for a flashback," which gets a knowing laugh from cinephiles in the audience who are familiar with the film's cult status. That or perhaps these films are too hard to insert poop, sex, or transphobic jokes into, which may be closer to the truth. The elevated horror movement, with its emphasis on slow burn dread, ambiguous endings, and thematic complexity, doesn't lend itself as easily to the kind of broad parody that Scary Movie specializes in. You can't really do a fart joke version of the dinner table scene in Hereditary without completely missing what makes that scene effective. With that said, there's a solid gag about Nosferatu 2024 during the post-credits sequence, and audiences should definitely stick around for it, and a considerably flatter one about Longlegs 2024 that seems to exist primarily because that film was in theaters relatively recently and the marketing campaign with Nicolas Cage's disturbing appearance generated significant social media buzz. The avoidance of elevated horror feels like a defensive move, as if the filmmakers know that really engaging with those films would require a different approach to parody, one that acknowledges the artistic ambitions of the source material while still finding the humor in it. It's easier to parody Scream, which is already half parody itself, than to parody something like The Witch, which takes itself completely seriously and earns that seriousness through craft and commitment. The sketch comedy structure, SNL on steroids. But it is the aforementioned scatological humor that really makes or breaks Scary Movie and the Wayans oeuvre in general, going back to the groundbreaking work on In Living Color, and continuing through films like White Chicks and Little Man. Their comedies, especially in this series, are less movies in the traditional sense than a series of thinly tied together sketches, individual comedic set pieces connected by the barest thread of narrative. It's R-rated, filthy-minded SNL that'll dare do a lynching gag or make jokes about Jeffrey Epstein or push boundaries that network television could never approach. Some of the gonzo bits work spectacularly, some don't land at all, and a few are outright hilarious, such as Shawn Wayans revealing that Shorty is in his 25th senior year at the local high school, a joke that works both as a parody of horror movie timelines, where characters often seem to be in high school for impossibly long periods, and as a character beat that's absurd enough to generate genuine laughter. And when it skips horror altogether and swerves into a John Wick parody. That's genuinely the best stuff here, with the film demonstrating that sometimes the funniest parodies are the ones you least expect. The action choreography in the John Wick sequence is actually impressive, with the filmmakers clearly understanding that to effectively parody action, you first have to execute action competently enough that the audience can appreciate the skill before you undercut it with humor. These moments of inspiration demonstrate that the Wayans brothers, when they're firing on all cylinders, still have the ability to create memorable comedy. The problem is that these moments are too infrequent, separated by long stretches of material that feels recycled, lazy, or actively unpleasant. But by design all of it feels antiquated and, old. The frame of reference for so many of the jokes dates back to the early 2000s, when the Wayans were last in control of the franchise. Cultural references that were timely 20 years ago now feel like artifacts from a different era, and not in the fun, nostalgic way the filmmakers clearly intend.
The generational divide. Kids these days, comedy. The Wayans would likely say that this dated quality is because they're bringing back raunchy comedy and the days where it was fun to offend everyone. when comedy could be provocative without worrying about social media backlash or cancel culture. There's a genuine argument to be made that comedy has become too safe, too concerned with not offending anyone, too calculated to avoid controversy. The pendulum may have swung too far in the direction of sensitivity, and there's value in comedy that pushes boundaries and makes audiences uncomfortable. Yet it's noticeable when entire sequences become about, man, kids these days, such as when Shorty and Ghostface end up getting some killer Twitch content, literally streaming their encounter for followers and likes. That one can still get a chuckle because it has a twinkle in its eye, a sense of playfulness in how it satirizes influencer culture and the way everything becomes content for social media consumption. The joke isn't mean-spirited, it's observational, finding humor in the absurdity of contemporary life without expressing contempt for the people living it. But when the twinkle shifts to malice, and Scary Movie 6 gets blood in its mouth and starts going for the jugular, it becomes something ugly and considerably less funny. There's a difference between provocative comedy and comedy that seems genuinely angry at its targets, and this film occasionally crosses that line. The generational comedy, older millennials and Gen X creators making fun of Gen Z sensibilities, could work if it came from a place of affectionate ribbing rather than genuine disdain. The original, Scary Movie, films made fun of generational differences too, but with an inclusive spirit that suggested everyone was in on the joke together. This new film sometimes feels like it's drawing battle lines, us versus them, old guard versus new guard. The trans question, when parody becomes punching down. A lot of the film's most uncomfortable moments boil down to jokes about trans kids and non-binary people, which represents a significant shift in the franchise's approach to LGBTQ+ humor. The Wayans have always enjoyed making fun of the differences in cultures and classes, using comedy to highlight social absurdities and challenge assumptions. And there is something eternally funny about Shawn Wayans' Ray character being a self-loathing gay man who now shows up to a Halloween party dressed as his manly hero, Jake Gyllenhaal in Brokeback Mountain, a reference that's 20 years old at this point but still gets laughs because of Wayans' committed performance. But those bits, even with their outdated references, use differences and stereotypes to highlight a live and let live sense of community in these movies. Ray's closeted homosexuality is played for laughs, certainly, but the joke is ultimately on the character's inability to accept himself, not on homosexuality itself. The film's perspective is that Ray would be happier if he could just come out and be himself, and the humor comes from his elaborate efforts to maintain a transparent fiction that everyone else can see through. It's a party where everyone gets hazed and everyone's invited, where the comedy comes from a place of inclusion even as it ruthlessly mocks everyone present. The spirit of the original films was democratic in its vulgarity. Everyone was a target, but everyone was also in on the joke. Scary Movie 6, however, pulls up the drawbridge and curls its lip when trans characters walk into the scene, treating them not as part of the community to be affectionately mocked but as outsiders to be ridiculed and rejected. It's the subtle difference between laughing with someone and laughing at them, between comedy that includes everyone in the joke and comedy that creates in-groups and out-groups. Or in parody movie parlance, at some point Scary Movie 6 stops siding with Sheriff Bart and the Waco Kid, the heroes of Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles, who use comedy to fight against bigotry, and starts giggling with Hedley Lamar's nitwit followers who are themselves the targets of satire. The film forgets that in the best parodies, we're supposed to identify with the people being oppressed by the system, not with the system itself. The trans jokes in Scary Movie 6 inches don't feel edgy or boundary pushing in the way the filmmakers seem to think they do. They feel lazy and mean, going for the easiest possible targets and the most obvious jokes. There's nothing clever about them, no insight or observation that would justify the offense. They exist purely for shock value, but in 2026, this particular brand of shock has become depressingly common in certain comedy circles, which means it's not even shocking, just tiresome and unpleasant. The pronoun train sequence, a case study. One sequence that crystallizes both the film's potential and its problems involves passengers on a train becoming violently enraged when lectured about using proper pronouns. On paper, this could be sharp satire. There's genuine comedic potential in skewering both performative allyship and reactionary overreaction, finding the absurdity in how a relatively simple concept of treating people with respect becomes a flashpoint for culture war combat. And for about 30 seconds, the sequence works on that level, with the escalating violence serving as an absurdist commentary on how disproportionate our cultural reactions to minor social changes can be. But the scene continues well past the point where the joke has been made, and as it goes on, it becomes clear that the filmmaker's sympathies lie more with the people refusing to use correct pronouns than with the people requesting basic respect. The comedy curdles from satire into sneering contempt, and what could have been a genuinely funny examination of cultural tensions becomes just another, kids these days with their pronouns, joke that your uncle might make at Thanksgiving. It's the difference between South Park at its best, finding the absurdity in all sides of a cultural debate, and South Park at its worst, using, "we make fun of everyone," as a shield for punching down at marginalized communities. What works? Moments of genuine inspiration. It would be dishonest to suggest that the film is a complete failure, because there are sequences and jokes that genuinely work and remind us why the Scary Movie franchise became a cultural phenomenon in the first place. The cold open featuring a celebrity cameo that I won't spoil here is genuinely hilarious, with the celebrity in question clearly having a blast sending up their own image and the filmmakers crafting a sequence that builds momentum and escalates absurdity in satisfying ways. It's the kind of set piece that the franchise built its reputation on, outrageous, shocking, but also cleverly constructed with actual comedic architecture rather than just random grossness. Faris and Regina Hall demonstrate that they haven't lost a step in the 25 years since the original film. Both actresses fully commit to the material, no matter how ridiculous, and their chemistry together remains delightful. A sequence where they try to reconnect after years of estrangement, conducted while increasingly insane horror movie events happen around them, showcases both their timing and their willingness to play the emotional reality underneath the absurdity. The Wayans brothers, similarly, show that they still know how to work together, with Marlon and Shawn's decades of collaboration evident in the way they play off each other. Shorty remains a weirdly endearing character despite being a one-note stoner joke, largely because Marlon Wayans invests him with a strange innocence that makes him more than just a collection of drug references. The John Wick parody sequence mentioned earlier deserves special recognition for being the kind of inspired tangent that the best Scary Movie installments have always excelled at, taking a detour from the main horror parody to mock a completely different genre, with impressive action choreography that's funny precisely because it's executed so well before being undercut with absurdity.
There's also a running gag about horror movie conveniences. The way cell phones never work, the way cars never start, the way characters always split up despite knowing better. That builds nicely throughout the film and pays off with genuine laughs. This is the kind of observational parody that the franchise should be doing more of, finding the inherent absurdities in genre conventions rather than just recreating scenes from specific movies with scatological additions. The comparison problem. When your targets do it better, that harms the movie significantly, as does the fact that despite parodying radio silence's Scream 5 and Scream VI, those films did a better job of satirizing modern horror trends, including making fun of that obscure A24 stuff in the original Ghostface and Wednesday scene, than this dedicated parody does. This is perhaps the most damning criticism one can level at a parody film, that the thing being parodied is more effective at self-parody than the parody itself. The modern Scream films have become so sophisticated in their meta-commentary that they've essentially absorbed parody into the DNA. They're simultaneously sincere horror films that generate genuine scares and knowing commentaries on horror film conventions that wink at the audience. They have their cake and eat it too, delivering both the thing and the critique of the thing in the same package. What's left for Scary Movie to do when its primary target is already doing the work of satire? The answer should be to find new angles, to go places that Scream won't go, to be more outrageous or more insightful or more something. But too often this film just recreates Scream scenes with added vulgarity, which isn't enough to justify its existence. The original Scary Movie worked in part because the original Scream played its meta-commentary relatively straight. The characters discussed horror movie rules, but the film itself was still fundamentally a serious horror movie. The parody had room to operate because there was a clear tonal difference between the sincere horror of Scream and the anarchic comedy of Scary Movie. Now that gap has closed considerably, with the Scream franchise incorporating comedy into its own fabric. The parody has less space to work with. This is a problem that affects all parody in the modern age. When everything is already somewhat self-aware and ironic, what does it mean to parody that self-awareness? The legacy of parody. How does this stack up? Scary Movie has never produced the best spoofs in cinema history, and to expect this entry to suddenly elevate the franchise to the level of the all-time greats would be unrealistic. It's less focused than Mel Brooks' 1970s output. Films like Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, and High Anxiety, that managed to be both hilarious parodies and genuinely good films in their own right, with memorable characters, quotable dialogue, and real narrative momentum. And it's never been as narratively committed to the bit as the Naked Gun series, both the original trilogy starring Leslie Nielsen and last year's surprisingly great reboot starring Liam Neeson, which demonstrated that the parody format can still work when executed with sufficient craft and creativity. Those films maintained their parody premise consistently throughout, with every element of the filmmaking serving the comedy. Scary Movie aims low and wide, operating on a philosophy of comedic saturation bombing. Throw enough jokes at the audience and some of them will land, with the hits hopefully outnumbering the misses enough to create an overall positive experience. In its better installments, including the original and the Zucker-directed third film, it hits enough targets to be worth the price of admission and the hour and a half of your life you're investing. Well, if you want to gaggle about gay panic jokes that haven't evolved since 2001 and celebrity cameos, including an admittedly great one in the cold open that I won't spoil but that alone might be worth seeing the film for, then the new Scary Movie lives up to its legacy in both the best and worst senses of that phrase. But it also sinks beneath it too often to give it a free pass based on nostalgia or franchise loyalty. The cultural moment. Comedy in 2026. Part of the challenge facing Scary Movie in 2026 is that the cultural landscape for comedy has shifted in ways that make this particular brand of humor feel increasingly out of step with where audiences are. That doesn't mean there's no audience for it. Clearly Paramount believed there was a sufficient market to justify greenlighting the project and the Wayans believed there was still value in returning to these characters. But comedy has fragmented in the streaming age. There's no longer a monoculture where a single comedy can dominate the conversation the way the original Scary Movie did in 2000. Audiences have self-selected into different comedy ecosystems, with some gravitating toward the cringe comedy of shows like The Office and Curb Your Enthusiasm, others preferring the wholesome positivity of Ted Lasso and Abbott Elementary, still others seeking out the transgressive boundary pushing of comedians like Dave Chappelle or Ricky Gervais. The gross-out, pop culture parody comedy that Scary Movie represents once dominated the multiplexes, but its cultural footprint has shrunk considerably. The success of films like Everything Everywhere All at Once and Barbie, both of which incorporate comedy but within sophisticated, thematically rich frameworks, suggests that audiences want more from their comedies than just a series of gags. That said, there's clearly still nostalgia for this era of comedy, as evidenced by the continued popularity of rewatching early 2000s comedies on streaming platforms. The question is whether that nostalgia is sufficient to sustain a new entry in the franchise or whether it would be better served by simply revisiting the originals. A mixed bag that can't escape its own contradictions. The new Scary Movie is neither a triumphant return to form nor a complete disaster. It exists in that uncomfortable middle ground where there's enough that works to prevent it from being dismissed entirely, but enough that doesn't work to prevent it from being enthusiastically recommended. For die-hard fans of the franchise who have been waiting 14 years for the Wayans to reclaim their creation, there will be moments of genuine joy in seeing these characters again and in seeing the brothers' distinctive comedic sensibility applied to a new generation of horror films. The nostalgia factor is real, and for some viewers, that will be enough to overcome the film's considerable weaknesses. For viewers coming to the franchise fresh or for those with more critical perspectives on comedy, the film will likely feel like a relic from a different era, one that hasn't adequately updated its approach to account for how both horror and comedy have evolved. The trans jokes in particular will be a deal-breaker for many, representing not edgy boundary-pushing but lazy, mean-spirited humor that punches down rather than up. The film's greatest sin is perhaps that it plays it too safe in some areas while being needlessly offensive in others. It avoids parodying elevated horror because that would require a different, more sophisticated approach to comedy, but it goes hard on trans jokes because, why? There's no artistic justification, no satirical insight, just a sense that the filmmakers think this is what edgy comedy looks like in 2026. Meanwhile, the horror parody that forms the backbone of the film is competent but uninspired, recreating familiar, Scream beats without adding enough new or funny to justify the exercise. When your parody is less interesting than the thing being parodied, you have a fundamental problem. If this new, scary movie is meant to launch a new era for the franchise, it raises questions about whether there's actually enough creative runway for that to work. The film makes money, which it likely will based on brand recognition and nostalgia. Will there be more? And if so, will they learn from what worked and what didn't here, or will they simply repeat the same formula with diminishing returns? The horror genre continues to evolve and produce fascinating material for parody. The parody format, despite being declared dead countless times, continues to prove viable when executed with sufficient skill and creativity. The Wayans brothers clearly still have comedic talent and the ability to generate laughs. But this film suggests that simply reuniting the old team and applying the old formula isn't sufficient. Comedy, perhaps more than any other genre, requires constant evolution and adaptation to remain relevant. What was transgressive in 2000 is tired in 2026. What was fresh then feels stale now. The franchise needs to decide what it wants to be. A nostalgia object for millennials who love the originals, or a living comedy franchise that has something to say about contemporary horror and contemporary culture. This film tries to be both and succeeds at neither, leaving us with a mixed bag that will satisfy some viewers while disappointing others. Welcome back, horror comedy fans. Today we're diving deep into the long-awaited return of one of the most iconic parody franchises in cinema history. Every once in a while in Scary Movie, which really should have been called Scary Movie 6, but never mind that numerical designation, we'll get into why they made that choice later. There's a gag that connects with the audience in that visceral, laugh-out-loud way that made the original film such cultural phenomena back in the early 2000s. Before we get into the full breakdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future reviews. And let me know in the comments below. Are you a fan of the original Scary Movie films? What's your favorite moment from the franchise? Let's get into this review. The jokes that actually land. Highlights from Scary Movie 2026. Let me start with the positive aspects, because despite its flaws, and we'll get to those, this movie does have moments of genuine comedic brilliance that remind us why we fell in love with this franchise in the first place. Like the one where Ray Wilkins, Shawn Wayans, gets up in front of a church congregation to declare that he's not gay, and then proceeds to rattle off an insanely detailed laundry list of all the gay activities he isn't going to be doing. This scene is absolutely hilarious because it takes the character's long-running joke from the original films, Ray's transparent closeted homosexuality that everyone can see through, and amplifies it to absurd heights. The comedy comes from the specificity and the sheer length of the list, with Ray going into increasingly elaborate detail about all the things he definitely, absolutely, certainly isn't doing, which of course only makes it more obvious that he's protesting too much.
Shawn Wayans delivers this monologue with perfect timing and commitment, never breaking character even as the joke becomes more and more ridiculous. The congregation's reactions, ranging from confused to uncomfortable to knowing, add layers to the comedy, creating a full scene rather than just a one-off gag. This is the kind of character-based humor that the franchise has always excelled at when it's working at its best. Or the one where Jack Cameron Scott Roberts, the love interest who's so square he must be the killer, he keeps getting compared to Ted Bundy throughout the film in increasingly elaborate ways, shows up at a party with his girlfriend, the high-strung pharmaceutical druggie Sarah, Olivia Rose Keegan, and her sister, the Wednesday Addams like Tuesday, Savannah Lee Nassif, and the three try to get themselves invited in, exactly as Remick the Vampire did in Sinners, by, in this case, playing a traditional banjo version of Movin' On Up from The Jeffersons. This joke works on multiple levels. First, it's a specific parody of a memorable moment from a recent horror film that many audience members will recognize. Second, it incorporates the unexpected musical element with the banjo cover of a classic TV theme song, creating a collision of cultural references that's inherently funny. Third, the performances are committed enough to sell the absurdity. These characters are genuinely trying their best to gain entry using this bizarre method, which makes it funnier than if they were winking at the camera. Or the one where Sydney Park plays a high school student who's so scoldingly politically sensitive that when she's being stabbed by Ghostface on the subway, an alarmed passenger refers to the victim as she, which makes Park cry out that they, them are her correct pronouns, at which point the alarmed passenger is annoyed enough to begin stabbing her as well. Now, this joke is going to be controversial, and we'll discuss the film's approach to contemporary social issues more later in this review. But from a pure comedy construction standpoint, the escalation works, the absurdity of someone being stabbed but still having the presence of mind to correct pronouns, followed by the even more absurd reaction of the bystander becoming a second attacker, creates a rhythm of escalating ridiculousness that's a hallmark of effective parody comedy. The jokes that don't quite land, missed opportunities. But then there are the jokes that work better in theory than execution, and unfortunately, these outnumber the successful gags by a significant margin. This is where the film starts to show its weaknesses, where you can see what the filmmakers were going for but the execution doesn't quite match the ambition. Like the one where Shorty, Marlon Wayans, that nasty stoner wastrel who's been a franchise favorite since the original film, is pulled down on a chair into a sunken place, a send-up of Get Out, that becomes the setup for an anime fantasy sequence where he sings a variation on Golden, built around the pleasures of weed. It sounds funny on paper, but kind of sits there on screen without generating the laughs it should. The problem with this sequence is that it goes on too long without adding new comedic elements. The initial concept is solid. Combining the horror of the sunken place from Get Out with Shorty's stoner character should create comedy gold. And the anime fantasy element adds another layer of unexpected absurdity. But the execution is flat, with the musical number not being catchy enough or funny enough to justify its runtime. It's the kind of joke that makes you smile and nod at the cleverness of the concept without actually making you laugh, which is ultimately a failure for comedy. Or the one where Art the Clown from the Terrifier movies shows up as Santa, but just as what he would do in one of the Terrifier movies, where he did appear as Santa in Terrifier 2. This is a perfect example of a reference that isn't actually a joke. The film is simply recreating something that happened in another movie without adding a parodic twist or satirical angle. For viewers who've seen Terrifier 2, it's just recognition without humor. For viewers who haven't, it's a random scene of violence without context. Either way, it doesn't work as effective parody. Or take Doofy Gilmore, Dave Sheridan, a lisping dimwit geek who washes with his own spit and is reprising his role from the original Scary Movie. He's a character so ineffectual yet grating that you're relieved when he's off. The problem here is that the character worked in small doses in the original film as a parody of Deputy Dewey from Scream, but here he's given more screen time without any new jokes or character development. It's simply repeating the same gag from 26 years ago without evolution, which highlights one of the film's biggest problems, nostalgia without innovation. The art of parody, what makes it work? At its best, the Scary Movie school of comedy, like the Naked Gun and Airplane school and all the other parodies that have sustained this genre for half a century, makes witty use of exaggeration, blowing up the cliches you didn't know were there, taking over familiar tropes and inflating them into glorious outsized goofs. The great parody films don't just recreate scenes from their source material with added silliness. They identify the underlying absurdity or contradiction in the original and amplify it until it becomes impossible to ignore. They make us see familiar material with fresh eyes, recognizing the ridiculousness that was always there but that we accepted because of genre conventions. Airplane worked because it took the self-serious disaster films of the 1970s and revealed how inherently ridiculous their conventions were. the stoic pilot with a traumatic past, the need for someone who can fly this plane, the sick passengers, all of it treated with melodramatic intensity that became hilarious when pushed just slightly further. The first, Scary Movie, worked because it took the self-aware horror of Scream and pushed it into completely anarchic territory, adding gross-out humor and sexual comedy to the slasher framework while also making sharp observations about racial dynamics in horror films and the absurdity of teenagers making predictably bad decisions. What makes a Scary Movie sequel hilarious as opposed to merely warmed over? It can be hard to put into words, but you know it when your funny bone feels it. You know it when you laugh out loud rather than just recognizing a reference or appreciating the effort. The overall comedy assessment, hit or miss. I didn't laugh out loud too much at Scary Movie, which is disappointing given my affection for the franchise and my hopes that the return of the Wayans creative team would reinvigorate the series. The film is a lot less funny than last summer's Naked Gun reboot, which proved that the parody genre can still work when executed with sufficient craft and creativity, though it's got the relentless energy of a mad dog comedy that keeps throwing jokes at you without pause. The majority of the jokes come off as more asserted than delighted. They feel like jokes because of their structure and setup, but they don't have that spark of genuine inspiration that makes comedy transcendent. And maybe that's because the film doesn't feel like it's discovering anything new about what's happening between the lines of the Scream genre or horror in general. There have been 7 Scream films at this point. This is the 6th Scary Movie, the first of which came out 26 years ago in 2000, and that original film was already a parody of Scream, which itself was a meta-commentary on horror films. The new film, which steps right up to mock itself for being a rebooty kill, a term combining reboot, sequel, and the requel terminology from recent Scream films, is as thick and layered with legacy characters, and also new characters, as the most convoluted straining for a demographic home run Scream sequel. It's jammed with spoof genre history and callbacks to previous installments, but that makes it feel more exhausting than exhilarating. It's a top-heavy satirical party that's become so meta it's meh, so self-aware about being a revival of a parody franchise that it loses sight of the need to actually be funny rather than just referential. The missed opportunities, what horror films should have been parodied. These movies have always been catch-all genre spoofs, which in the case of horror means there's a lot of ripe terrain that Scary Movie could have plowed. I liked the nods toward skewering Sinners, the recent horror film, but why didn't that movie play a bigger part? It's a perfect target for parody with its period setting, its exploration of racial themes, and its distinctive visual style. Scary Movie 5 came out 13 years ago in 2013. A lot of horror has passed under the bloody bridge since then. We've seen what many critics call a horror renaissance, with the genre achieving new levels of critical respectability and artistic ambition. So why not expand the film with juicy jabs at Midsommar, or the Conjuring films, or the Amy Madigan Harridan character in Weapons? Midsommar, in particular, seems like it would be comedy gold for a Scary Movie treatment. The bright daylight horror, the flower crowns and folk traditions, the increasingly disturbing rituals, the relationship drama at the center, all of it is ripe for parody. The Conjuring universe with its interconnected ghost stories and exorcisms and haunted objects offers endless possibilities. These are films that take themselves seriously and have distinctive visual and narrative styles that would be fun to satirize.
Scary Movie features a brief skewering of the substance, which somehow becomes an off-center joke about the Epstein files that doesn't really land, but the movie is presented, more than anything, as a family franchise that's riding shotgun on the power of the Scream franchise. The Wayans Army. Too many cooks. The script is by Marlon Wayans, Shawn Wayans, Keenan Ivory Wayans, Craig Wayans, and Rick Alvarez. The film even makes jokes about how many Wayans there are, which is at least self-aware, and they have bound themselves to the Ghostface saga as if it were the only thing that mattered in horror. The killer keeps popping up throughout the film, as in a Scream film, and that sustains the tone of comic aggression. But the knockabout violence has the effect of steamrolling the wit. Instead of the violence being in service of the comedy sometimes feels like it's in service of recreating Scream beats, which is backwards for a parody. The meta problem. Parodying a parody. As if it needed to be pointed out, the Scream films have always been parodies of themselves, That was true of the first one in 1996, and by this point they've become mega parodies of their own decadence. The recent Scream films are so loaded with self-referential commentary, discussions of requels, and elevated horror, and toxic fandom, that they're practically doing the work of parody themselves. So, Scary Movie, in ridiculing that quality, just seems to be adding another layer to the schlock cake of overkill. It's parody of parody of parody, Russian nesting dolls of meta-commentary where each layer is less funny than the last because there's less actual substance to satirize. Tiana Taylor, seated at a bar in the skimpiest of gold lame outfits, talks to the killer in the opening sequence, but the real gag is that she's playing a super brassy version of herself, complete with Oscar jokes and references to her music career. This opening actually works quite well. It's one of the film's highlights, because it finds a fresh angle by making it about celebrity and self-promotion rather than just recreating the Scream opening with added gore. The raunch factor, sex, drugs, and gross-out humor. Maybe the reason the film doesn't spend more time skewering the nuances of contemporary horror, though we do get to see Megan do a booty dance, which is amusing but underdeveloped, is that its real other subject is raunch. The Wayans brothers let fly with sex gags, whether it's the quivering purple butt plug the lascivious L. Ruby Snober carries around as a recurring visual gag or the incendiary oral sex as rolling a blunt session she receives from her boyfriend, Greg Wayans, another member of the comedy dynasty. This has always been part of the franchise's identity. The gross-out humor, the sexual comedy, the willingness to go places that mainstream comedies won't. And for fans of this style of humor, the new film delivers what they're looking for. The question is whether simply delivering more of the same is enough when the culture has moved on and this brand of comedy has become less dominant in the mainstream. The raunch sometimes feels like it's compensating for a lack of actual satirical insight. When you can't think of a clever joke about a horror movie, just add a sex joke or a gross-out gag and call it a day. That's not always true, but it happens often enough to be noticeable. The legacy characters. Faris and Hall return. Anna Faris and Regina Hall have been in every movie of this series, except for the misbegotten Scary Movie 5, which neither actress appeared in and which is generally considered the franchise low point, and both are back with good sport glee that's genuinely touching to see. Faris's Cindy Campbell is now the den mother of the franchise, the original final girl now aged into a survivalist recluse a la Laurie Strode in the recent Halloween films. Faris hasn't lost a step in her physical comedy or her ability to play sincere emotion in the midst of absurdity, and seeing her back in this role after so many years generates genuine nostalgic warmth. Hall's Brenda Meeks, the self-described cool black mom, brings the same energy and comic timing that made her a standout in the original films. The chemistry between Faris and Hall remains delightful, and their scenes together are among the film's highlights simply because we can see how much fun they're having reuniting these characters. Kim Wayans has a few good moments as an incredibly hostile ICU nurse, playing against type in a way that generates laughs through sheer aggressive energy. The climax, cameos and chaos. The climax, which features more characters playing Ghostface than you can count, is long on unbilled cameos, which I won't reveal here because part of the fun for audiences will be the surprise of seeing who shows up. But that joke is past its sell-by date. The surprise cameo has become such a standard marketing tool in modern franchise filmmaking that simply doing it isn't itself funny anymore. You need to do something with the cameos beyond just having them appear. The structure of the climax, with multiple ghost faces and reveals and twists, is so convoluted that it becomes difficult to follow, which might be intentional as a parody of overly complicated horror movie finales, but it also just makes the ending feel messy and unsatisfying. Box office expectations versus artistic success. Scary Movie, which is set to find a big audience this weekend based on early tracking and the built-in nostalgia factor, shows you that a comedy series can be successful even when it's making a joke of how recycled it is. The film is likely to perform well commercially because there's genuine affection for this franchise and because the marketing has effectively targeted millennials who grew up with the original films. But commercial success and artistic success aren't the same thing, and while this film will probably meet Paramount's financial expectations, it doesn't quite recapture the magic that made the original such a cultural phenomenon. The horror landscape. What's changed since 2013? To really understand this film's missed opportunities, we need to look at what's happened in horror since the last Scary Movie installment 13 years ago. The genre has experienced a remarkable renaissance, with films like Get Out, Hereditary, A Quiet Place, It Follows, The Witch, and many others achieving both critical acclaim and commercial success. This elevated horror movement, horror films with artistic ambitions and serious themes, would seem to be perfect targets for parody. These are movies that sometimes take themselves very seriously, that invite thematic analysis and symbolic interpretation, that aspire to be more than just scary movies. That combination of self-seriousness and genre convention should be comedy gold. But Scary Movie largely sidesteps these films, perhaps because parodying them would require a different approach than the franchise's usual method of crude humor and pop culture references. You can't really do a fart joke version of Hereditary without missing what makes that film work, which means you'd need to find a different angle of attack, a more sophisticated form of satire. The film's avoidance of this material feels like a missed opportunity to evolve the franchise's comedy style to match the evolution of the genre it's parodying. The pronoun debate. Contemporary. Social commentary. The film's approach to contemporary social issues, particularly around gender identity and pronouns, is going to be one of its most controversial aspects. The subway stabbing scene mentioned earlier is representative of the film's overall stance. It's willing to make jokes about these topics but doesn't seem particularly interested in having a point of view beyond, this is all pretty silly. For some viewers, this will feel refreshing. Comedy that's willing to poke fun at contemporary social sensitivity without being preachy or taking sides. For others, it will feel like lazy, cheap shots at marginalized communities, the comedic equivalent of kids these days, complaining without the insight or observation that would make it actual satire rather than just mockery. The question is whether the jokes are punching up at performative allyship, at the absurdity of culture war battles over minor issues, or punching down at trans and non-binary people themselves. The film's execution makes it unclear which it intends, which is perhaps the biggest problem. Effective satire needs a clear perspective and point of view. Comparisons. How does it stack up against other recent parodies? When compared to last year's Naked Gun reboot, Scary Movie comes up short. That film, while not perfect, demonstrated that the parody genre can still work when approached with craft and precision. It had a clear understanding of what it was parodying, police procedurals and action films, and consistently found fresh angles on familiar material. Scary Movie too often falls back on simple recreation with added vulgarity rather than actual satirical insight. The Naked Gun reboot proved that parody can work without relying entirely on gross-out humor or shock value, that there's still an audience for clever wordplay, visual gags, and comedic timing. The comparison reveals that Scary Movie's approach is fundamentally unchanged from 26 years ago, while the best modern parodies have evolved to match contemporary sensibilities while maintaining the core principles of good comedy. The technical aspects. Direction and production. From a technical standpoint, the film is competently made but uninspired. The direction by director name gets the job done without adding visual flair or using cinematography itself as part of the comedy. Horror parody offers opportunities for visual jokes, recreating iconic shots and then subverting them, playing with lighting and camera angles to set up gags, but the film mostly just points the camera at the actors and lets them do their thing. The editing is similarly functional without being particularly clever. Comedy editing is an art form. The difference between a joke that kills and one that dies can come down to holding a shot for one extra beat or cutting away at precisely the right moment. This film's editing gets the basics right but rarely demonstrates the kind of precision that separates good comedy from great comedy. The production design does a decent job of recreating iconic horror movie locations. The house from Get Out, various Scream settings, and so on, which at least shows attention to detail in the parody elements. The music and sound, supporting the comedy. The musical score and soundtrack are a mix of horror movie music parodies and contemporary hip-hop and pop tracks. The score effectively mimics the style of various horror franchises, which is essential for parody. You need to establish the reference before you can subvert it. The use of "Movin' On Up" from The Jeffersons in the Vampire Invitation sequence is a highlight, demonstrating how the right musical choice can elevate a joke. More moments like this, where music becomes part of the comedy rather than just background, would have strengthened the overall film.
1990 slasher films, led creatively by the Wayans family, Marlon, Shawn, and Keenan Ivory Wayans, among others. It was vulgar, chaotic, and often offensive in ways that felt genuinely risky rather than focus grouped. It was also, crucially, hilarious, and a massive box office hit. Then came the infamous disputes with Miramax and the Weinstein era, which saw the core Wayans creative team pushed out of the franchise before Scary Movie 3. The series continued without them under director David Zucker, shifting toward a more visual gag-heavy style that was safer, broader, and considerably less pointed. The core cast, Anna Faris, Regina Hall, Marlon Wayans, and Shawn Wayans, was largely absent from parts 3 and 4, and when the franchise limped into parts 5 and 6 territory under other creative hands, it had lost almost everything that made it distinctive. So the reunion premise of this new Scary Movie 6 carries genuine emotional weight. The Wayans are back, Faris is back, Hall is back. After nearly 25 years, the band is getting back together, not for a cash grab under someone else's banner, but ostensibly to reclaim something that was taken from them. For longtime fans of the series, that story alone is enough to purchase a ticket. Director Michael Tidders, who hasn't previously helmed a Scary Movie installment but has become a trusted collaborator within the Wayans orbit over the past decade, having worked with Marlon Wayans on A Haunted House and its sequel, brings a familiarity with the comedic rhythms that a franchise outsider would lack. He does solid work here, reminding audiences why these performers became comedy icons in the first place. The cast chemistry, despite the long layoff, is largely intact. These are people who clearly enjoy working together, and that ease translates to the screen in the film's best moments. Anna Faris is still the secret weapon. Let's start with what works, because what works is genuinely enjoyable. Anna Faris, returning as the beloved Cindy Campbell, remains the franchise's MVP by a comfortable margin. The Scary Movie final girl has always been one of the more underappreciated comic performances in modern mainstream comedy, a character who functions as the series' emotional anchor even as chaos erupts around her, and whose seemingly endless capacity for sincerity amid absurdity gives even the flattest jokes a fighting chance. In Scary Movie 6, Cindy has evolved. Rather than playing the naive ingenue of the original films, Faris steps into the aging survivor archetype, a clear and direct riff on Jamie Lee Curtis's late-period Laurie Strode persona from the David Gordon Green Halloween trilogy. It's smart casting and smart writing. It acknowledges the passage of time within the franchise's mythology while also satirizing a very real and very prominent trend in contemporary horror, the Legacy sequel, The Returning Icon. Faris navigates the shift beautifully, finding surprising emotional texture in jokes that, on the page, probably read as fairly thin. She's doing heavy lifting and making it look effortless. Regina Hall, returning as fan favorite Brenda Meeks, is similarly delightful. Hall has had an extraordinary career in the years since Scary Movie 2, cementing herself as one of the most versatile comic actresses working today, and she brings all of that accumulated skill to bear here. The film's most consistently funny extended sequence involves Brenda in an elaborate riff on Octavia Spencer's unhinged performance in Ma, 2019, a joke that works on multiple levels, calling back to the franchise's history of parodying specific genre-adjacent performances while also capitalizing on Hall's obvious pleasure in the material. It's one of the clearest examples in the film of what Scary Movie can be at its best. Then there's Olivia Rose Keegan as Sarah, Cindy's daughter, arguably the most inspired piece of new casting in the film. The 26-year-old actress delivers a pitch-perfect Anna Faris impression that walks the very fine line between homage and parody, and when Scary Movie 6 leans into the mother-daughter dynamic between Cindy and Sarah, it finds a genuine narrative through-line that the film's messier subplots lack. Keegan is a discovery, and her chemistry with Faris feels earned rather than manufactured. Where the Wayans stumble, here's where things get complicated. The script, co-written by Marlon Wayans, Shawn Wayans, Keenan Ivory Wayans, Craig Wayans, and Rick Alvarez, is an uneven document that suggests genuine creative tension between the family's instincts and whatever pressures, internal or external, shape the final product. Marlon's Shorty Meeks and Shawn's Ray Wilkins, two of the most beloved characters from the original films, struggle to find their comedic footing in Scary Movie 6 in ways that are genuinely surprising given how much the franchise has been built around them. Shorty's weed obsession arc, which was fresh and funny in 2000, now feels like a relic rather than a knowingly retro callback. Ray's, not gay but definitely gay, persona, which always walked a provocative tightrope in the original films, doesn't quite navigate the changed cultural landscape with the sureness that it needs. These feel like characters written to fulfill franchise obligations rather than because anyone had something genuinely new to say about them. More young cast members are added to flesh out a narrative that circles Paramount's own Scream 6, 2023, as its primary satirical target, a choice that generates the film's most interesting structural problem. Parodying your studio's own IP, within a film distributed by the same studio, is an inherently compromised creative position. The film can mock the Scream franchise all it wants, but it's never going to bite a hand that's feeding it. The satirical landscape, what's skewered, what's spared. Scary Movie 6 has plenty of targets it swings at with varying degrees of success. A background gag involving Final Destination, Bloodlines lands beautifully, sharp, specific, and timed perfectly. A particularly vicious joke aimed at last year's I Know What You Did Last Summer reboot earns the big reluctant laughs that signify genuinely uncomfortable comedy done right. A brutal quip about John Wick and Lionsgate's spin-off culture is the kind of cross-studio corporate mockery that feels genuinely brave given the context. A reference to the 2014 indie sensation It Follows is both objectively wrong about the film it's discussing and, somehow, still decently funny. The celebrity cameos are mostly excellent. The cold open, in particular, signals immediately that the Wayans' understanding of stunt casting as a comedic tool hasn't dulled. Without spoiling specifics, it's the kind of opening gambit that generates exactly the right amount of goodwill, a reminder of what this franchise can do when it's operating at its peak.